Section 2 of Rambles in New Zealand by John Carne Bidwill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswax Candle. Section 2. I left Tauranga at about 1 o'clock on the 17th of February 1839. This day's journey was not above 15 miles and was almost entirely over a plain covered with fern. The walk was, however, quite enough for me for that day, and I was very glad when the tent was pitched, and I enjoyed my pot of tea and piece of bread and pork with an appetite an alderman might have envied. There is something inexpressibly delightful in living in a tent. Snail-like, you carry your house wherever you go, and for my own part, I always sleep much better in a tent than in an inn, and enjoy my meals infinitely more in the open air, sitting at the mouth of my tent like the shepherds of old, than I should if I had the best dinner that ever was cooked in a smoky hotel in London. I recollect while in England that a very little thing would put me out of conceit with my tea, and I could no more think of relishing it without white sugar than eating a piece of dry crust covered with mould. But here I always used to think the tea excellent, though boiled in a common tin pot, or pannikin as the sailors call it, and drunk out of the same, and sweetened with coarse brown sugar. And I used to dole out the remnants of bread when they were quite blue, as if it was the greatest luxury in the world. So much are our tastes as well as ourselves liable to be altered by circumstances. 'Twas not till long after this, however, that I was short of bread, as by the kindness of my friends at Tauranga I was loaded with bread, roast meat, etc., and was not yet reduced to the necessity of eating potatoes with my tea, or cold potatoes without salt for lunch. I have often seen the natives eat raw potatoes, and once living crawfish. Two things I was never so hard pushed as to try. We crossed one river about 15 yards wide and knee-deep, very rapid and running over a smooth bottom of rock. It would form a fine mill stream, as the banks are very high and close to the edge of the river, which indeed seems to be a characteristic of nearly all the rivers I have seen in New Zealand. February 18th. The whole of the road today was through very thick woods, the land moderately level and exceedingly rich. We crossed another river about the same size as the one we passed last night, and a great many smaller streams, most of them having channels, not exactly like ravines, but quite as deep and steep in proportion to their breadth, and only differing in having their sides covered with forest, and evidently not subject to inundations. New Zealand is undoubtedly wonderfully well watered. Yet today we passed at least 10 miles without seeing any stream, although the ground was anything but flat. Probably the water soon soaks through the substratum, which appears to be of a soft volcanic stone. The whole basis of the soil, the earthy part, is pumice, but you may dig 6 inches deep through beautiful black mould before you come to any vestige of that substance. The trees were chiefly the toa, a tree strongly resembling the beech in leaf and general appearance, and bearing a fruit about the size and colour of a damson, but with a very large seed. Some of the fruit are sweet and pleasant, while others, on the same tree, are very poor and taste strongly of turpentine. The wood is about the hardness, and has just the appearance of beech. It is rarely more than 2 feet in diameter. The rimu, the most beautiful tree in the world when young, has branches very slender and pendulous, and the leaves very small, not much broader than hairs, and set all around the twigs, so the tree looks as if it was composed of chenille fringes. The berry is much like that of the yew, to which tree the rimu is nearly allied. It is sweet and eaten by the natives. The wood resembles in colour that of the apple tree, and is brittle. It is one of the largest trees in the forest. As it becomes old, it loses its extraordinary beauty, the leaves shortening until they are mere scales. Next in abundance is the miro, a tree exactly like the English yew, but bearing sweet berries about the size of horse beans, with an internal seed. The wood is dark, fine-grained, rather soft, though harder than deal, and very tough. Its largest size is about 2 feet diameter. From its great beauty it would well deserve to be grown in England, and as I have found it growing as high up in the mountains as any other tree, I have no doubt it would be perfectly hardy. The largest tree I have seen in the country is very common in these woods, but is not peculiar to them, although in other than rich soil It never arrives at even the size of the kauri. It is a soft white wood, and is always decayed in the middle. It exactly resembles the elm in leaf, and very much in growth and bark. But I could never succeed in procuring a specimen either in flower or seed. I have measured a tree 37 feet in circumference, but such are rare, and were they more common would be useless from the bad quality of the wood. These are the chief trees in the richest description of dry woods, such as those I passed between Tauranga and Rotorua. The rata, in my opinion the monarch of the New Zealand forest, is occasionally found very large in these woods, but prefers a more clayey and hilly soil. It is often 60 feet high without a branch, and from 4 to 5 feet in diameter. The wood is a fine pale brown, equal to mahogany in beauty, and African oak in hardness and durability. It is a first-rate shipbuilding wood, but on the east coast is rare. As you approach the west coast it becomes common. It belongs to the myrtle family and is very closely leafed, with small, brilliantly green oval leaves growing by threes around the stem. The flowers are very numerous, small and scarlet, I am told. I have climbed many trees, but never succeeded in finding any seed or seed vessels in any state of decay, but once found 3 young plants, which I have got. They were growing in a rotten branch high from the ground and had roots very much like potatoes, and as large in one instance as a walnut. This accounts for the natives saying there are never any young ratas. I have no doubt that, like many trees of tropical climates, they never grow from the ground, but to it. That is, they strike root in the branches of another tree and afterwards send roots down to the soil through the trunk of their supporter as it decays. It would be a magnificent ornamental tree in England if it would grow, which I think possible, as it would be utterly unlike any tree at present known in Europe. The foliage being very dense at the extremities of the branches, but nowhere else, it looks like a number of small trees, such as box, growing out of one another, or out of the gigantic stem of an oak. The tanakaha is also occasionally to be met with, but only on the steep sides of gullies. It prefers a poorer soil. It is the most curious tree in the country, being a coniferous one, with the branches proceeding from the trunk as regularly as in any spruce, and yet having broad leaves very like the leaflets of some ferns. The wood is exceedingly tough and durable, but unfortunately does not grow sufficiently large for masts, except for small vessels. Its largest size is 18 inches diameter, and about 25 to 30 feet to the branches. It would live in England, and will be a very great curiosity. In similar places is to be seen a very curious shrub or small tree, which when young has the most extraordinary leaves I ever saw. On a plant 5 feet high, I have measured leaves 26 inches long, yet not more than 3/4 of an inch broad. In deep shade they are beautifully variegated with pink and white. It is an Aralia, and has highly perfumed flowers, a quality, by the way, quite characteristic of New Zealand plants. I have met with more sweet-scented flowers here than in any other place I have visited. As we passed through the woods we found 2 plantations of potatoes, which would have rendered our bringing any quite unnecessary had we known of them. As my natives never seemed to consider that these kinds of plantations belonged to anybody, we always used to help ourselves when we came to any of them without compunction. In fact, I suppose that these patches must have been planted by some of the mission natives, on purpose to save trouble when they went their journeys between the 2 stations. The woods are exceedingly full of gigantic climbers, the most troublesome of which, because most abundant, is a smilax of enormous size. It bears large bunches of red berries, of which the natives are very fond. Its stems are amazingly strong and tough, and are used for a great variety of purposes, the most common of which is the building of houses, where it supplies them with laths to which they tie their palm leaves and other materials for forming the walls. Our encampment tonight was on the top of a very high and steep hill, and as we had no kettle to carry water, I was obliged to use my mackintosh, which answered very well by making a hoop to hold up the edges. I pride myself on my invention, and think Mr. Mackintosh ought to send me a new one for finding out a new use for this article of clothing, and thereby enhancing its value. At this place I first observed the deficiency in the alphabet introduced by the missionaries. It consists only of 14 letters, and although B and D are frequently used in speaking, their sounds are represented by P and R in writing. The indiscriminate use of these letters is the consequence, producing great confusion and embarrassment to learners of the language. Thus, some tribes will say rimu and others dimu, keri keri and kidi kidi, etc. And others will use the sound expressed by R in their alphabet in such a way that it will puzzle any European to understand what was said. I certainly think it would be much better if the alphabet had been furnished with all the letters that the natives could have sounded, and although perhaps at first they might have been a little confused in using them with the proper exactness, very little practice would have overcome that difficulty. The language would have gained by it in clearness and intelligibility. Besides, as Mr. Busby, the resident at the Bay, says, it would have been a mark whereby to distinguish the educated from the uneducated, the gentleman from the vulgar. After the letter N, A has a nasal sound, somewhat resembling that in Nantes. In Maori, New Zealand language, it is not difficult to express the sound by desiring the experimenter to say na without moving his tongue, with his mouth a little open, at the commencement of the sound, at the same time admitting a little air through his nose. I think this sound will be much better represented by GN than NG, as is now done. But still either would be erroneous, as the sound is not on the consonant, but in the vowel. The name of one of the Bay of Islands, Ngapui, is an example of this sort of Russian combination. The natives have neither F, G, I, or L, but change them for other letters. S they leave out entirely. It is impossible to make them pronounce any words having these sounds in them. For example, knife is nahi, the two syllables and the NH being distinct. My name, John, is Honi, James, Hemi, etc. Wilson is changed to Widihina, Stack, Taka, Chapman, Tapimana, with a suppression of the H at the beginning, or not quite, Tapimana. The nearest approach to be found for my name was Bidiwidi, or Pidiwidi. Those gentlemen whose names I have made use of will no doubt excuse me, as I was at a loss for other illustrations. Very few except missionaries are called by their surnames, all the others being Honis, Hemis, Widhams, Williams, etc. The framer of the alphabet was, I understand, thus sparing of his letters in order to make the language as simple as possible, without taking into account the difficulties of expressing with them those modulations of sound on which the richness and the melody of a language so much depend. They have but 5 vowels: A, E, I, O, U. I, as in Waikato, could have been conveniently superseded by Y as a vowel, although the natives cannot make the consonantal sound of that letter. In like manner, there is no character to signify E as in Edward or West, and yet that is a pure vowel sound and is constantly to be found in the language. It appears to me that had the object been to make the language as simple as possible, that object would have been much better effected by augmenting rather than diminishing the number of vowels which characterize the English and the other European tongues. For instance, had there been A and AH, with a separate character, E as in we and another as in West, I, O, and U, it would have been comparatively easy for any foreigner to learn the pronunciation of the language from the books, whereas at present it is as impossible as any old mother language. For instance, who could know how to pronounce HAU, which is pronounced exactly as how in English, whereas WAW is pronounced just as the same letters would be in English. But it is useless to multiply instances which evidently must be innumerable. The chief reason I see for regretting the present system is that I think the formation of the Maori language into a written one would be such an excellent opportunity of showing how perfectly the written words of a language might be made to indicate the sounds. A desideratum never to be obtained in any European language, as it would be impossible to make a whole generation learn an entirely new alphabet when they were accustomed to an old one which gave them no inconvenience from having always been accustomed to it. But when people knew no alphabet, there would have been no difficulty in teaching them as many letters as were necessary to indicate, at all events, all the simple, if not many of the common compound sounds. In case of the colonization of the country by Europeans, this meagreness of the alphabet will be at a great disadvantage, as it is next to impossible to learn the New Zealand, or indeed any other language, without the use of books. Of course, there are individuals who would soon acquire any language, but I am speaking of the mass. Now, in proof of the difficulty which I speak of, I can state that I have met with but one person, and never heard of more than 4 in all the country, who could speak Maori so perfectly as to be able to ask even the simplest question not connected with their trade in such a manner as to immediately make the Maoris understand what they said. And the greater part of them, including men who have been many years in the country, are incapable of speaking more than a couple of dozen sentences, and those not correctly. Of course, I do not include the missionaries, who all speak the language fluently, but it is to be considered that it is their whole study for a long period after they arrive, that they have the advantages of the prior labours and researches of their brethren. The very much greater influence possessed by the mission than by any other persons over the natives is, in my opinion, chiefly to be ascribed to their superior knowledge of the language, and not to any feeling of gratitude for the many benefits conferred on them by the mission. Indeed, I am afraid that they have no such feeling as gratitude, even in the weakest sense, and I am the more inclined to think so from the fact that they not only have no phrase corresponding to thank you, but no form of words to use when they receive a present. If, when you give them anything, they do not ask immediately for something else, which is generally the case, they are silent. But they generally manage to find out something corresponding to the thing you give them, for which they will immediately put in a demand. Thus, if you give a fig of tobacco, you may be sure that they will ask for a pipe. If a knife, for a string to hang it about their necks with. Or if even a musket, they will ask depreciatingly, what is the good of it without some powder and ball? And that too, if they have plenty of the article by them at the time. This evening, they all pretended they had no tobacco in order to get some from me, although they had more than they could smoke in a couple of days. The mission boys were very attentive to their prayers and hymns every evening and morning, and commenced them always without my reminding them, which I had been desired to do by their masters in case of their omission. The greatest rogue in the company was Reader. At least so I found him afterwards. At that time he passed with me for quite a Simon Pure. I was much pleased with the apparent devotion displayed by him in reading and the others in their responses, but I found that the longer we were out, the worse got his reading, and I was often obliged to find fault with him for slurring over his prayers. But it is like children everywhere when they get out of sight of their masters, and these were only children of a larger growth. They were all young men of not more than 20. Their names were, well, at least the names they told me, for they often have a dozen: Koekoe, Kuekui, Marua, Tomedel, Tongao. Missionaries, or so we should say Christians, Moningao and Mahia, heathens or devils, as they sometimes call themselves. It seems rather curious to hear a native, in answer to a question as to whether he is a missionary or not, reply quite coolly, "No, I'm a devil." By the by, I have generally found these devils the best working and most civil fellows among them, and think a very reasonable question might be raised as to the relation among the Maoris of conversion and laziness. Moningao and Mahia were striking instances of this. They certainly were worth more than the other 4. The first named was quite a treasure. It would have been so as a servant in any country. He always carried my bedding and tent, a heavier load than that of any of the others, especially if it had rained in the night, or we started early in the morning before the dew was off. Yet he was always in first after me at the resting places, and always close at hand to roast potatoes, fetch water, or any other thing that might be wanted, and even without being told, whereas I sometimes had to tell the others a dozen times if I wanted them to do anything of the kind while he was away. The other fellow, Mahia, used to carry such loads that one day, when Mr. Koekoe was very saucy, I made them change loads as a punishment to him, which he at first pretended to be very willing to do, but after an hour's trial, during which time I kept behind him to prevent his deceiving me by giving up a part of his load to others, he fairly gave in, and afterwards, if he offended me, I only had to threaten him with Mahia's load to make him keep close to my heels all day afterwards, which is all I wanted, his load consisting of my books for specimens of plants, etc. I've certainly observed that the missionary natives are the most impertinent and least willing to work. but that ought not to cause ill will towards their teachers, as it too often does. Most of the Europeans laying all the blame of the progressive craftiness of the natives to the missionaries, who, they say, spoil them and teach them their impudence, whereas the fact is the missionary natives, knowing more than their uninstructed brethren, like all people who know very little indeed, but yet something, are apt to think that they know a great deal and presume accordingly. They often fancy that they know quite as much as the Pakeha Maoris, a name applied to the pork traders, etc., who have native women for wives, if not as the missionaries themselves. There is a terrible dislike amongst the low Europeans generally to the missionaries, and it is easily accounted for. The former all live with native women as wives, which is discountenanced by the missionaries. The generality of them are great scoundrels, runaway convicts, sailors, etc., who, with the ordinary rancour of low minds, dislike people superior to themselves in intelligence and respectability, especially when they see that in spite of their utmost efforts, the influence of the missionaries is greater, even among those not professing to be Christians, than ever they can expect to acquire, for the very obvious reason that the disinterested exertions of the preachers are all directed to one object, and they all support each other, while the others only work for themselves and hate one another in proportion to the proximity of their residences. With regard to what they all say about the missionaries causing the natives to sell their produce of pigs, etc., dearer and require more for their labour, it is wholly without foundation. For one pig, or pot of potatoes or corn that the one buys, the others buy 500, and to my certain knowledge the mission price for labour is not more than half that which the Pakehas give. I also know that the price paid for pigs, etc., is not more in one instance than the other, and if it were, it could do the traders no harm, as the mere trifle used for food, which is all that is bought by the mission, could never have any influence on a market where thousands of tons are bought for the export trade. We started from our last encampment, past a good deal of tolerably level and very rich ground, traversed, however, by several very deep watercourses, and after an hour's walking over a tract of fern, arrived at a small pa on the banks of Lake Rotorua. Having heard so bad a character of the Rotorua tribe, I was rather anxious to get over to the missionary settlement, which is an island in the middle of the lake. The natives did not appear very friendly to my Waikato men, but did not offer to molest them. Messrs. Morningau and Mahia did not, however, seem to be particularly comfortable until a canoe was launched for our embarkation. All were so eager to go, in order, as I afterwards found, to participate in the payment, that the canoe was very nearly swamped several times before we reached the island, and my paper for specimens was so soaked that it took a whole day to dry. I afterwards became used to them and would never let more go with me than I wanted. Each man expected a fig of tobacco for paddling, and the owner of the canoe the same. I think I had to pay 12 of them, twice as much as need have been paid. Had I known as much then as I did afterwards, I should have only let 6 go instead of 12, and felt much less fear during the passage. The lake of Rotorua is about 10 miles wide. The shores are generally low, and the wood has been almost entirely removed by the natives. There is but one spot where it approaches the water, and that not very extensive. There are several piles on it, and a small number of inhabitants on the island where the missionary establishment is. The country is not so populous as it has been. I was informed by the missionaries that a few years ago, when the celebrated Bay of Islands chief Hongi came there, he killed 3,000 of them, and they have not since been able to recover their numbers. They are a very warlike tribe, and are said to be a finer race of men than any other, but great thieves. They are now at war with all the tribes around them, except the Taupo tribe, who are too distant to render them any valuable assistance. The lake is almost surrounded by boiling springs, mud volcanoes, and solfataras. I think it is probable that there are many hot springs in the deep part of the lake, as it is pleasantly warm to bathe in, which is not to be expected from the natural temperature of the atmosphere, which here is exceedingly chilly. The missionaries say it is the coldest place in the island. The temperature was rarely above 58 indoors, and in the evening the fire was always very much in request. We arrived at Rotorua in the evening, and received a hearty welcome from Mr. Chapman, the only missionary there at the time. I found from him that there would be some difficulty getting on, as the influenza was more recent here than at Tauranga, and consequently the people were weaker. He, however, promised to assist me to the utmost of his power. Mr. Chapman had just returned from Taupo, and was the first white man who had ever penetrated so far. He had been obliged to return sooner than he wished in consequence of the illness of his natives, some of whom he left behind. As I could not get away from Rotorua for 2 or 3 days, I employed myself in visiting the hot spring, etc. on the lake. The shores are barren and low, but there are high hills rising all around at no great distance, generally sloping up immediately from the water and covered with trees at the summit. The hills are from 600 to 1,000 feet high and have a very barren appearance. The island, nearly in the middle of the lake, is about 500 feet high and is very steep. It is a mile long, and there may be 50 acres of it sufficiently level for cultivation. These level spots are carefully planted with cormorants, corn, etc., but are not rich enough for potatoes, which are never planted by the natives but on newly cleared land, which they abandoned after the third year's crop. It then becomes covered with fern, and in a few years more is rendered fit for nothing by the constant fires destroying whatever vegetable matter is formed by the decayed plant. There are numerous hot springs on the island. They are all at the edge of the lake and formed into baths by the natives, making an open wall of stone around them, so as to admit a sufficiency of cold water to render them bearable to the skin. In all of them, although nearly boiling and strongly impregnated with sulphuric acid, there may be seen plants growing independently of the patches of green which cover the bottom. Several of the springs contain sulphuret of iron, as may be seen by the stones, all of which are bronzed by the deposit, often so completely as to look like pieces of pyrites. There are great numbers of shellfish in the lake, and also crawfish, sometimes 8 inches long, both of which are articles of food for the natives and of great consequence to them, as there are no fish except eels, which are scarce, and some little fish not so large as minnows, which they catch in their nets made in the shape of a sparrow trap, and eat dried. The largest hot springs are at the Great Pa, one of which is 8 or 9 feet across, with a stream running from it 4 feet wide. The water at the place whence it issues is, I have no doubt, hotter than boiling, as it appears to come up in the form of steam. It is quite clear, and has but little taste, although it smells strongly of sulphuric acid. The rocks around are encrusted with a whitish efflorescence of an intensely sour taste, which I regret I had no means of preserving. The natives cook all their food in the streams of hot water by putting it into a basket and letting the water flow through it. It does not at all injure the flavour of the vegetables, but I have never tasted any meat so cooked. The whole of the ground about the Great Pa is full of springs and holes from which steam escapes, so that great caution is required in walking about, as a false step might sink you to your middle in boiling mud. The sites of the springs are constantly changing, and a place which today is quite hard may tomorrow break in when trodden upon. Deaths arising from accidents of this kind are very frequent. The whole ground is so hot that the insides of the native huts are hardly bearable, and I think must be very unwholesome. There was plenty of very fine tobacco growing near, although I never at any other place met with any that was worth gathering. I saw here for the first time a chief fed by a woman, not being able to feed himself because he was tabooed. It had a most ridiculous appearance to see a full-grown man fed like a child with pap. The food was in a calabash and pushed by the woman's fingers to the edge so that it should fall into his mouth. About a mile from the Pa are a number of mud volcanoes, if they may be so called, consisting of hollows, varying from 50 to 150 feet across, filled with mud about the consistence in general of pea soup. This mud is constantly bubbling and making a most curious noise. In some of the holes there have been formed cones of mud about 10 feet high. In these places it is of a somewhat thicker consistence, and I suppose the bubbles always escape at the same places. The mud is not hot, and the water which drains off is very nauseous, quite different in taste from that of the hot springs, which might be drunk on an emergency. There is about a square mile covered with these mud springs, the paths between the hollows not being more in many instances than a foot wide. It is a most desolate place, and the country around very barren, quite different from what it is in the neighbourhood of the hot springs. About 4 miles off is the largest solfatara in the neighbourhood. It is in a little valley. The actual hot portion is about 150 yards across, with a muddy hollow in the middle, out of which runs a stream of hot water. The crystals of sulphur in the crevices are very beautiful, but it was impossible to take away any specimens without breaking them. I do not know to what depth the sulphur extends, but it did not seem to be above 2 feet. Up to that depth there appeared to be nothing but earth, or at all events the earth formed the larger portion of the mass I dug up. The sulphurous rock was very hot, even on the surface, but closely surrounded by vegetation. I had knocked off a number of specimens to bring away, when the natives said I should not have them unless I paid for them. I told them I should not want them at all, but as they would carry them to the boat, which is about 1.5 miles off, they should have a fig of tobacco, which arrangement compromised the matter. Had an instance of their thieving talents here for the first time. I had taken off my coat in order to climb a tree. When I wanted to find some tobacco which I had put into my pocket, it was missing. This was, however, almost a solitary instance of my losing anything by the natives of this part of the island. Of those in the Thames I cannot say so much. After 2 or 3 days' delay, I started from Rotorua with the same natives I had before, and 1 or 2 extra ones, among whom was a chief called Rangionere, who went, he said, as my friend. I found this gentleman very useful in carrying me over muddy places, rivers, etc. on his back, he being the only one of the company at liberty for that purpose, all the others being laden with food, etc., which the chiefs are prohibited from carrying on their backs. I did not wish him to go, but was glad of his company afterwards. He was a very quiet fellow, and made himself as useful as could be expected of a chief. The only thing he ever refused was to lend me his tomahawk to cut sticks for firewood, it being taboo, for cutting open men's heads, I suppose. However, he had no objection to cutting a walking stick or a tent pole with it, a distinction which seemed rather ridiculous. The first day's march from Rotorua was about 10 miles only, as we started late. The road led through the mud springs I have mentioned and was very barren. We crossed several streams and encamped at the entrance of a wood, where there were several old huts and a potato plantation. The natives had a large copper mauri to cook the pork they brought with them. For the first time I saw them eat the common milk thistle. They cook it as constantly as the leaves of the wild turnip and cabbage, and seem to relish it just as much. It is so precisely like the English milk thistle that I am almost inclined to think it must have come with the potato. There is another plant which has puzzled me, the common plantain, which is everywhere quite as general as in England. I can see no difference. Not being an article of food, the natives can tell nothing about how or when it came. Were the contrary not well known, the potato might be taken for an indigenous plant, as it is impossible to go anywhere without finding it growing wild. As we know it has not been introduced more than 50 years, this diffusion of the root may be considered wonderful. We may be led to suppose from this circumstance that the climate is exceedingly favourable to the growth of the potato, yet New Zealand potatoes in general are very bad, and will not fetch in Sydney above half the price of those from Van Diemen's Land. End of section 2.